My name is Megan Sullivan, and I was 24 years old when I learned that the worst thing my family ever stole from me wasn't my college fund. It was 8 years of my life, because they convinced me I had thrown my own future away. They almost got away with it, until the scholarship committee stood up in front of an entire room of people and accidentally exposed every lie they'd been telling since I was 18. If stories about justice finally catching up with the people who thought they were untouchable are your kind of thing, make sure you're subscribed. And while you're listening, let me know in the comments. What would you have done if your own family stole your future? Now let me tell you how mine did. People like to believe betrayal always feels dramatic, like you'll hear ominous music in your head, or suddenly realize something is wrong. It doesn't. Real betrayal is quiet. It grows in the spaces where trust should have been. It looks like dinner around the kitchen table. It sounds like your mother saying she's proud of you. It feels like your father putting his hand on your shoulder and promising everything will work out. And then one day you wake up and realize every memory has been poisoned. Growing up, I honestly believed I had the kind of family other people envied. We weren't rich, not even close. My dad worked as a maintenance supervisor for the county parks department. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep the lights on. My mom worked part-time at a dental office. We lived in a small house just outside town, the kind with faded blue shutters that Dad promised he'd repaint every summer but somehow never did. It wasn't perfect, but it felt safe. At least, it did when I was a kid. I was the oldest. Then came my brother Tyler, 3 years younger than me. If you've ever grown up with a sibling who could do no wrong, you'll understand exactly what I'm about to describe. Tyler wasn't a bad kid. Not at first. He just learned very early that the rules were optional for him. If I forgot to wash a dish, I got grounded. If Tyler broke a window throwing a baseball through the garage, boys will be boys. If I got a 93 on a test, Dad would ask what happened to the other 7 points. If Tyler managed a 70, Mom acted like he'd solved world hunger. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. Kids don't like admitting their parents have favorites. You tell yourself there's another explanation. Maybe they're harder on me because I'm older. Maybe Tyler needs more encouragement. Maybe next time it'll be different. It never was. By the time I reached high school, I'd stopped asking why. I simply accepted that I had to earn everything. Tyler only had to exist. Ironically, that became my greatest strength. I threw myself into school. Every assignment mattered. Every exam mattered. I joined debate club, volunteered at the public library, tutored middle school students, worked weekends at a grocery store after I turned 16. Not because anyone forced me, because I had a dream. I wanted to become a civil engineer. I loved bridges. I know that sounds strange. But when other kids looked at bridges, they saw concrete. I saw ideas becoming reality, something designed carefully enough to hold thousands of lives every single day. There was something beautiful about that responsibility. Mr. Harris, my physics teacher, once kept me after class. I panicked, assuming I'd done something wrong. Instead, he smiled. Megan. Yes? Have you started applying for scholarships? I've looked. You should look harder. I laughed nervously. There are students smarter than me. He shook his head. No. There are students with better connections. Students with richer parents. But not many who work as hard as you. I carried those words around for months, whenever things got difficult. Whenever Tyler mocked me for studying on Friday nights. Whenever Mom asked why I couldn't relax more. Mr. Harris believed I could do something extraordinary. Sometimes one person believing in you is enough. Senior year became a blur. Applications, essays, interviews, SAT scores, financial aid forms. I practically lived inside the guidance counselor's office. Then came the acceptance letter. The thick envelope. The one everyone dreams about. I still remember standing on our porch, the paper trembling in my hands. University of Michigan. Accepted. I screamed. Mom ran outside. Dad hugged me. Tyler actually smiled. For one afternoon, everything felt perfect. That night we celebrated with pizza. Dad even toasted me with a can of root beer. You earned this. I always knew you would. My heart felt so full I thought it might burst. Then came the question I'd been terrified to ask. So, I know tuition is expensive. Dad nodded confidently. We've planned for that. Mom smiled. Don't worry. Your college fund will cover a lot more than you think. College fund. Those two words. I had heard them my entire life, whenever relatives gave birthday money. It'll go into your college account. Whenever Grandma sent $50. Straight to college. Every Christmas. Every achievement. Every little contribution. It all goes toward your future. I never questioned it. Why would I? Parents don't lie about things like that. Do they? I spent the next few weeks calculating costs. Scholarships covered part. Grants covered some more. The college fund would bridge the gap. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. For the first time, the future wasn't just a dream. It had an address, a campus, a dorm room, a life. Then, exactly 6 weeks before orientation, everything changed. Dad called me into the living room. His expression was strange, too serious. Mom sat beside him, hands folded tightly. Tyler wasn't there. I remember noticing that. Megan. Dad cleared his throat. We need to talk. My stomach dropped. What happened? Mom wouldn't look at me. Dad sighed heavily. The economy hasn't exactly been kind. I frowned. What does that mean? He rubbed his forehead dramatically. The college fund. There isn't much left. My ears rang. I'm sorry. What? Mom finally spoke. There were emergencies, Dad continued. The house. The truck. Medical bills. Life happened. I stared, unable to process the words. How much is left? Silence. I asked again. How much? Dad looked at the carpet. Nothing. The room disappeared around me. Nothing. Not less than expected. Not enough for one semester. Nothing. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain refused to believe what I'd heard. What do you mean? Nothing? Mom reached for my hand. I pulled it away. We always intended to rebuild it, Dad said. But things kept coming up. I thought you'd understand. Understand? I couldn't breathe. What about all the birthday money? What about Grandma's gifts? What about every single time you told me? Dad interrupted. Don't raise your voice. Something inside me cracked. I've spent 4 years working myself to death because you told me there was money. Dad's face hardened. We never guaranteed anything. Yes, you did. No, you assumed. The sentence hit harder than anything else. You assumed. I looked at Mom. She looked away. I have acceptance letters, I whispered. I already committed. Dad shrugged. Take loans. Lots of people do. My entire future had just become a debt sentence. But you promised. Dad stood up. Conversation over. We've done the best we could. You'll figure it out. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until sunrise. Every memory replayed itself. Every birthday, every Christmas, every promise, every reassuring smile. By morning, I wasn't crying anymore. I just felt empty, like someone had quietly reached inside my chest and removed every hopeful part of me. But the cruelest moment hadn't happened yet. That came 2 days later, because I accidentally overheard a conversation that would haunt me for years. And once I heard it, Nothing about my family would ever look the same again. I wish I could tell you that what I overheard 2 days later was some dramatic confession. It wasn't. That's what made it so much worse. It was casual, comfortable, like two people discussing what to have for dinner instead of dismantling their daughter's future. I had come home early from my shift at the grocery store because my manager let me leave after I spent half the afternoon making mistakes. I couldn't focus. Every barcode blurred together. Every customer asking, "How are you?" felt like a cruel joke. When I pulled into the driveway, Dad's truck was already there. I wasn't expecting him home until later. The front door was locked, so I walked around the side of the house toward the garage entrance. That's when I heard their voices through the half-open kitchen window. Mom sounded worried. She looked completely crushed. Dad sighed. "She'll get over it." "You don't know that." "I know Megan. She always lands on her feet." There was a pause. Then Mom asked the question that changed everything. "What are we going to tell Tyler if he asks where the money came from?" My heart stopped. "Money?" Dad laughed. "We'll tell him exactly what we've always told him. That we've been saving for his future." I felt my knees weaken. No, I had misunderstood. I had to be misunderstanding. Mom lowered her voice. "I just hate that it had to be her fund." Dad answered so quickly it was obvious they'd had this conversation before. "It wasn't her fund. It was our money. And Tyler needs it more." The words slammed into me harder than any scream ever could. Our money. Needs it more. I stood frozen beside the garage wall, barely breathing. Mom wasn't arguing anymore. She just sounded tired. "I still feel guilty." Dad's reply was sharp. "For what?" "Megan has scholarships. She's responsible. She'll figure something out. Tyler won't. If we hadn't helped him, he'd have nothing." "Helped him?" "Helped him with what?" Then Dad said something I'll never forget. "If one kid has to struggle so the other one succeeds, you bet on the one who actually needs the help." I didn't hear the rest. I couldn't. My ears were ringing so loudly it drowned everything else out. I turned around and walked back to my car before they even realized I'd been there. I drove. No destination, no plan. Just road after road while tears blurred every traffic light into streaks of red and gold. I finally parked beside the small lake where my grandfather used to take me fishing when I was little. I sat there until sunset, trying to make sense of the last 18 years. Every birthday card, every $50 bill from Grandma, every relative proudly saying, "This will help with college." Every single dollar. Gone. Not because life happened. Not because emergencies came up. Because my parents had decided my younger brother was a better investment. The next week became a blur of phone calls. I contacted the university's financial aid office. I explained everything. Well, not everything. How do you tell a stranger your parents stole your future? I simply said there had been an unexpected financial hardship. The woman on the phone sounded genuinely sympathetic. "We'll review your file." I thanked her. Then I waited. Every day felt like a month. Eventually, the answer came. There wasn't enough aid available that late in the admission cycle. I could defer. Or decline. I read the email over and over. It was polite, professional, final. I walked into the bathroom, locked the door, sat on the floor, and cried until my throat hurt. Not loud, not dramatically. Just the kind of quiet crying where your chest aches more than your eyes. Grandma noticed. She always noticed. She invited me over the following Sunday. Her tiny house smelled like cinnamon and old books. It always had. She poured tea without asking questions. That was her way. Eventually, she said softly, "So, what's wrong?" I wanted to tell her. Every instinct screamed at me to tell her, but another voice stopped me. Dads. Don't embarrass the family. Moms. Private matters stay private. So I lied. I couldn't afford school. Grandma frowned. I thought your parents had been saving. My stomach twisted. I almost said it. Instead, I forced a smile. Things changed. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know how hard you worked. That hurt even more, because she believed I'd simply been unlucky. She had no idea she'd unknowingly helped build the very fund that disappeared. Meanwhile, Tyler's life seemed to improve overnight. He suddenly had a newer car. Not brand new, but newer than anything our family had ever owned. Dad called it a lucky deal. Then Tyler started talking about attending an expensive trade academy across the state. Funny, 2 weeks earlier, everyone insisted money didn't exist. Now tuition wasn't a problem. Whenever I asked questions, Dad became defensive. Stop keeping score. It's none of your business. None of my business. The money relatives had spent 18 years giving for my education was somehow none of my business. I gave up the university. I stayed in town, worked more hours, picked up evening shifts cleaning offices. During the day, I worked the grocery store. At night, I vacuumed empty conference rooms where people discussed budgets larger than I'd ever see in my lifetime. I was exhausted, constantly. There were nights I'd fall asleep still wearing my work shoes. Some mornings I'd wake up convinced I'd missed my classes. Then I'd remember. There were no classes. There was no campus, no dorm, no engineering degree, just fluorescent grocery lights and sore feet. Social media became torture. Friends posted photos moving into residence halls, football games, late-night pizza, study groups, new roommates, new beginnings. I hit like on every picture. Then I put my phone face down and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't jealous of the parties or the freedom. I was grieving the life I had spent years believing I'd earned. One afternoon, Mr. Harris came through my checkout lane. He blinked. Megan? I forced a smile. Hi. He looked around. What are you doing here? I knew what he meant. He thought I should have been halfway through my first semester. I swallowed. Plans changed. He frowned. You were one of the strongest students I've ever taught. I shrugged. Life happens. He studied me for a moment, then quietly asked, Is that really what happened? I couldn't answer, because if I started talking, I wasn't sure I'd ever stop. Years passed. Not many, but enough. I enrolled in community college one class at a time, paying cash whenever I could. It took forever. One semester I'd take calculus. The next I'd have to skip because my transmission failed. Life became a series of delays, small compromises, tiny steps forward. I watched classmates younger than me graduate before I finished prerequisite courses. Every delay reminded me of the years I'd lost. The strange thing about betrayal is that eventually it becomes normal, not acceptable, just familiar. I stopped expecting apologies, stopped asking questions, stopped hoping one day my parents would sit me down and admit they'd been wrong. Instead, our conversations became painfully ordinary. How's work? Fine. How's school? Slow. You'll get there. As if they hadn't been the reason it was slow. As if they hadn't quietly rewritten the entire trajectory of my life. Then, 6 years after I graduated high school, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. Not an email. An actual letter. Cream-colored envelope. Heavy paper. My name written neatly across the front. The return address belonged to the Riverside Community Scholarship Foundation. I almost threw it away. I assumed it was another fundraising request. Instead, inside was an invitation. They were holding the foundation's annual scholarship banquet. Former applicants, donors, recipients, teachers, and local families were invited. Mr. Harris had nominated me as a guest speaker. A guest speaker? I laughed out loud. There had to be a mistake. Why would anyone want to hear from someone whose dreams had fallen apart? Then I reached the final paragraph. We would be honored if you shared your educational journey and the obstacles you overcame. Your perseverance has inspired many younger students. For the first time in years, someone saw more than my failure. Someone saw that I had kept going anyway. I called the number at the bottom of the page. A cheerful woman answered. "We're so glad you called, Megan. We really hope you'll attend." I hesitated. "You know I never finished the path I originally planned?" "We know. That's exactly why we want you there." After hanging up, I sat silently at my kitchen table. It would have been easy to decline, to avoid reopening old wounds, to pretend the past no longer mattered. But something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, this dinner was going to change something. I had no idea how right that feeling would turn out to be, because across town, my parents had received the very same invitation. And none of us knew that before the night was over. Someone on that scholarship committee was about to reveal a piece of information that had been buried for nearly a decade. If you'd asked me the morning of the scholarship banquet whether I believed in fate, I would have laughed. Not because I was cynical, because I'd spent the last 6 years watching life reward the wrong people. Good grades hadn't saved me. Hard work hadn't saved me. Doing the right thing certainly hadn't saved me. The only thing that had kept me moving was stubbornness. Some mornings, that was enough. Other mornings, it wasn't. Still, when 6 o'clock rolled around, I found myself standing in front of the only full-length mirror in my apartment, smoothing the wrinkles out of a navy blue dress I'd bought secondhand 2 years earlier. It wasn't fancy, but it made me feel presentable, professional. Like maybe I belonged in a room full of scholarship recipients and community leaders instead of stocking grocery shelves before sunrise. I tucked a loose strand of brown hair behind my ear and looked at my reflection. 24. Older than I should have been for where I was in life. The girl who'd dreamed about engineering still looked back at me, but she seemed quieter now, more careful. I picked up my purse, locked the apartment door, and drove toward the community conference center. The closer I got, the tighter my stomach became. The parking lot was already filling up. Parents posed for photos beside flower beds. Teenagers in suits adjusted crooked ties. Young women in elegant dresses laughed together while balancing folders full of scholarship information. The excitement in the air was contagious and painful. I remembered being 18. I remembered believing that was supposed to be me. For a split second, I considered turning around. No one would blame me. No one would even notice. Then I heard someone call my name. "Megan?" I turned. Mr. Harris. He hadn't changed much. His hair was grayer than I remembered, but his smile was exactly the same. "There you are." He walked over and gave me a quick hug. "I was afraid you'd changed your mind." "I almost did." "I'm glad you didn't." He stepped back and looked at me. "You look well." It was the polite kind of lie adults tell each other. I smiled anyway. "You cleaned that up nicely." He chuckled. "I've missed your sarcasm." For the first time all week, I laughed. A real laugh. Not forced. Not polite. Just real. Inside, volunteers handed out name tags. Mine had a small gold sticker beneath my name. Guest speaker. Seeing those words made my heart race. A young volunteer pointed toward the reception area. "They'll call you up after dinner." Dinner. Speech. Go home. Simple. Or so I thought. I had just picked up a glass of iced tea when the room suddenly became much smaller, because my parents walked in. Dad wore the same dark suit he'd worn to every wedding and funeral for the past decade. Mom smiled politely at people she recognized, and behind them, Tyler. Confident, relaxed, expensive watch, tailored jacket. The kind of confidence that comes from never wondering whether you'll land on your feet. For a brief moment, none of them saw me. I watched them greet donors, shake hands, smile for photographs. They looked like the picture-perfect local family. No one looking at them would ever imagine what they had taken from their own daughter. Then Tyler noticed me. His eyebrows lifted. Meg? Dad turned. His smile faded almost instantly. What are you doing here? I held up my name tag. I was invited. Mom blinked. Oh, I didn't know. There was an awkward silence. Tyler broke it first. So, you finally transferred somewhere? No. You still taking classes? One at a time. He nodded with exaggerated sympathy. Well, everyone has their own path. I don't know why that sentence irritated me so much. Maybe because he'd never had obstacles placed in his path. Maybe because he thought perseverance and delay were the same thing. Dad cleared his throat. We're actually sitting with the donor families. I'm sure you understand. There it was again. That familiar tone. The quiet reminder that I occupied a different place than they did. I understand. I smiled. You should probably get to your table. For just a second, Dad looked relieved, as if he'd expected a confrontation. Not tonight. I wasn't interested in making a scene. I'd spent years carrying anger. It was exhausting. Dinner began with speeches from local business owners. Students accepted awards. Families applauded. There was laughter, hope, dreams, everything I'd once imagined for myself. Eventually, the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. I'd like to recognize one individual whose perseverance has inspired our committee. He smiled toward my table. Megan Sullivan. The applause startled me. I hadn't expected people to clap. Walking toward the stage, I kept reminding myself to breathe. The lights were brighter than I expected. Rows of faces disappeared into the darkness beyond them. I adjusted the microphone. My name is Megan Sullivan. My original plan was to stand here tonight and tell you how everything worked out. A few polite chuckles. It didn't. The room became very quiet. I learned something after high school. Life doesn't always reward preparation. You can do everything right and still lose the future you imagined. I spoke about community college, working 2 jobs, studying during lunch breaks, watching friends graduate before me. I never mentioned my parents, never mentioned the missing money. I simply talked about resilience. When I finished, people stood. A standing ovation. My eyes filled with tears, not because I thought I'd given an extraordinary speech, because for the first time in years, people weren't looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with respect. As I stepped away from the podium, an older woman approached. Silver hair, warm smile. A name badge identified her as Margaret Collins, Scholarship Committee Chair. Megan, that was beautiful. Thank you. She hesitated. I was hoping we could speak privately after the awards. Of course. There are a few administrative questions I'd like to clear up. Administrative? I frowned. Did I fill something out incorrectly? She smiled. Nothing serious. I'll find you afterward. It seemed harmless, so I thought nothing of it. The evening continued. Award after award. Scholarship after scholarship. Parents dabbed tears from their eyes. Students hugged one another. I genuinely felt happy for them. No one deserved to lose opportunities because of someone else's choices. Then, just before the final scholarship announcement, Margaret returned to the stage. There is one final matter. Her tone had changed, more formal. The room quieted immediately. Each year, our foundation audits donor-funded educational trust accounts connected to our scholarship programs. I barely listened. It sounded like accounting. Dad, however, shifted slightly in his chair. I noticed because he hadn't moved all evening. Margaret continued. This year, while reviewing historical records, we discovered a documentation error involving one of our community education trusts. A projector lit up behind her. Spreadsheets, dates, account numbers. Still meaningless to me. Then she said a name. Sullivan Family Education Trust. My heart skipped. Surely there were other Sullivan families. Weren't there? Margaret looked down at her notes. The trust was established in 2006 through combined family contributions and donor matching. My hands began to shake. Donor matching? I had never heard those words before. The account designated beneficiary. She paused. Was Megan Sullivan. Every sound disappeared. I slowly turned toward my parents. Mom had gone completely pale. Dad wasn't looking at the stage anymore. He was staring at the floor. Tyler looked confused. Margaret continued speaking. According to the records, the account should have remained legally restricted until the beneficiary reached college enrollment age. Legally restricted. I couldn't process the words. The committee recently discovered withdrawal authorization submitted several years before eligibility. The room was silent. Utterly silent. Margaret wasn't accusing anyone. She sounded genuinely puzzled. As a result, our auditors initiated a compliance review. She looked toward one of the committee members. We have since verified that the withdrawals were inconsistent with the trust agreement originally signed by participating parties. People around the room began whispering. I could hear chairs creaking. Someone coughed. No one knew exactly what they were hearing, but everyone knew it wasn't good. Then Margaret said the sentence that made my entire world tilt. The committee has invited all relevant parties to remain after tonight's ceremony, so we may resolve the discrepancy. She looked directly toward my table, then toward my parents. We believe the beneficiary was never informed that the trust contained donor-restricted funds. I couldn't breathe. Beneficiary. Donor-restricted. Never informed. My father slowly lifted his eyes. For the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine fear on his face. Not anger, not irritation. Fear. Because whatever secret he thought had been buried 8 years earlier had just been brought into the brightest room in town. And judging by the expressions on the committee members' faces, they already knew far more than I did. For several long seconds, no one moved. The applause that had filled the auditorium only moments earlier had dissolved into uneasy whispers. I could hear silverware clinking as volunteers quietly cleared untouched dessert plates. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone coughed. Margaret Collins stepped away from the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, she said calmly, we're going to take a brief recess before concluding the evening's program. She looked directly at me. Megan, if you don't mind joining us in the conference room. Then she turned toward my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, we'd appreciate your presence as well. Dad stood so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. There has to be some misunderstanding. Margaret's expression remained polite. That's exactly what we'd like to determine. The conference room felt much colder than the ballroom. A long oak table stretched down the center, already covered with neatly organized folders. Margaret wasn't alone. 2 other committee members sat quietly beside her, along with an attorney representing the foundation. As soon as the door closed, Margaret folded her hands. First, Megan. I'm very sorry. I blinked. For what? For what should have been discovered years ago. She slid a thick folder toward me. This scholarship foundation doesn't simply award grants. Many local families also establish educational trusts through our office. I looked down. Across the top page were words I had never seen before. Sullivan Family Education Trust. Beneficiary, Megan Elizabeth Sullivan. My own name, typed in black ink. Dated 18 years earlier. My throat tightened. I, I've never seen this. We know. The attorney spoke gently. The records indicate you were never given copies. He opened another folder. When the account was established, every contribution made by qualifying relatives was matched at 25% through a community education initiative. I stared. Matched? Grandma's birthday money, my aunt's graduation gifts, Christmas envelopes. Every dollar had grown, every single contribution. Dad suddenly leaned forward. This is ridiculous. We were her parents. It was our account. The attorney looked at him evenly. No, sir. It was an educational trust. You served as custodians. There is an important legal distinction. Silence. The attorney continued. Custodians may manage funds. They do not own them. He produced another document. Unfortunately, several withdrawals were authorized for purposes unrelated to the trust agreement. Mom lowered her head into her hands. Dad said nothing. The attorney listed them one by one. Vehicle purchase, private tuition, credit card consolidation, home renovation, general household expenses. Each item felt like another piece of concrete dropping onto my chest. Years of sacrifice. Gone. Not because disaster struck. Not because the family was starving. Because someone decided my future could solve their present. Then came the final entry. Transfer to another educational account. Beneficiary. Tyler James Sullivan. I looked across the table at my brother. His face had gone completely white. What? He looked at Dad. What is that? Dad didn't answer. Tyler shook his head. No. You told me Grandpa started that account. Dad remained silent. You said you saved it. Still nothing. Tyler turned to Mom. Mom. Tears streamed silently down her face. I didn't know, Tyler whispered. I swear I didn't know. For the first time all evening, I believed someone in my family. The attorney closed the file. Our audit began because donor matching funds cannot legally be redirected. The paperwork raised concerns. Margaret added quietly. Once we reviewed the original records, it became clear that the beneficiary had never received notice. She looked at me. That beneficiary was you. I could barely speak. So, I wasn't imagining it. No. There really was a college fund. Yes. And it existed exactly as your relatives intended. Every birthday, every Christmas, every promise. They had all been true. I hadn't invented any of it. For years, I had wondered if my memories were somehow wrong, whether I'd misunderstood what everyone meant. Now I finally knew. I hadn't been mistaken. I'd been deceived. The weeks that followed changed everything. The foundation referred the matter to the appropriate authorities and to the financial institution that had administered the trust. I won't pretend the process was quick. It wasn't. Audits rarely are. Lawyers exchanged letters. Records were reviewed. Statements were taken. My grandparents' old contribution receipts surfaced from dusty filing cabinets. Canceled checks appeared. Bank employees confirmed signatures. Facts have a remarkable quality. They don't care how uncomfortable they make people. News spread through our town faster than I expected. Not because anyone held a press conference. Because communities are built on conversations. People remembered handing my parents birthday cards with checks inside. They remembered fundraising dinners. They remembered my acceptance to college. The story gradually assembled itself without anyone needing to exaggerate it. For years, people had believed I simply couldn't afford school. Now they understood why. The sympathy I received wasn't satisfying. I didn't want pity. What mattered was something much simpler. People finally knew the truth. Tyler came to see me one rainy Saturday. He stood outside my apartment holding a cardboard box. I don't know if you'll even open the door. I did. He set the box on my kitchen table. Inside were old birthday cards, photographs, letters, even a faded drawing I'd made in third grade of a bridge labeled Future Engineer. I found these in Mom's attic. He swallowed hard. I've been reading everything. He looked exhausted. I really didn't know. I believe you. I should have asked more questions. You were a kid. So were you. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he pushed an envelope toward me. Inside was a cashier's check. I sold my truck. You don't have to. I know. But I have to live with myself. I can't undo what happened. But I also can't pretend that education they paid for was entirely mine. I stared at him. The amount wasn't enough to erase the past. Nothing could. But it represented something far more valuable: responsibility. He wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He was acknowledging reality. There is a difference. My parents reached out several times. At first, through messages, then letters. Eventually, they asked if we could meet. Months passed before I agreed. When we finally sat across from one another, they looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Dad spoke first. I kept telling myself I was protecting the family. I listened. He continued. Then one compromise became another. And eventually, I couldn't admit how far I'd gone. Mom quietly added, I should have stopped it. I didn't. I'm sorry. I believed they regretted what happened. I also understood something important. Regret and repair are not the same thing. Some things cannot be restored with an apology. Trust is one of them. I accepted their apology. I did not return to the relationship we once had. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Sometimes it's simply choosing not to carry the anger anymore. 3 years later, I finally walked across a university stage. Not at 18, at 27. It had taken nearly a decade of night classes, transferred credits, part-time semesters, and relentless persistence. When they called my name, Megan Sullivan, I paused for just a heartbeat before accepting my diploma in civil engineering. The loudest applause came from the front row. Mr. Harris, Grandma, Margaret Collins, and Tyler. There was one empty seat. Dad had chosen not to come. I never asked why. Mom sent flowers instead. The card contained only one sentence. I hope this is the beginning you deserved all along. I kept the card. Not because it erased anything, because it reminded me that people can recognize the truth, even if they discover it too late. A year after graduating, I stood on the observation deck of a newly completed pedestrian bridge overlooking the river outside town. My company had assigned me to the design team. It wasn't the largest bridge I'd ever helped build. It wasn't famous, but families crossed it every day. Children rode bicycles across it. Students walked over it on their way to school. I rested my hand on the railing and smiled. When I was 18, I thought my parents had stolen my future. In a way, they had. They stole years, opportunities, confidence, time I'll never recover. But they didn't steal the person I became while rebuilding everything they took. That part remained mine. The scholarship committee uncovered the truth. The documents exposed the lies. The community witnessed the consequences. Justice came, though not in the dramatic way I'd once imagined. It arrived through records, accountability, and people willing to ask difficult questions. Sometimes revenge isn't watching someone's life collapse. Sometimes it's refusing to let their betrayal define the rest of yours. And every time someone crosses that bridge without ever thinking about who designed it, I smile to myself. Because somewhere beneath the concrete and steel is a lesson I learned the hardest way possible. The strongest foundations are built on truth. Everything else eventually cracks. Looking back now, I don't think the greatest loss was the money. Money can be earned again. Degrees can be finished later. Dreams can be rebuilt, even if it takes years longer than anyone planned. The hardest thing to recover was trust. When the people who are supposed to protect your future become the ones who quietly take it away, it changes how you see the world. For a long time, I questioned my own memories. I wondered if I had misunderstood the promises, if I had expected too much, or if somehow I was the selfish one. That kind of doubt stays with you long after the truth comes out. But here's what I learned. The truth has remarkable patience. People can hide it, delay it, bury it beneath excuses, guilt, and years of silence. But if the truth is built on facts, sooner or later it finds its way into the light. Mine did. Not because I demanded revenge, not because I exposed anyone myself. It happened because honest people cared enough to ask one more question and refused to ignore an inconsistency. That's why accountability matters. Not because it changes the past, because it prevents a lie from becoming someone else's future. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Don't let someone else's betrayal convince you that your worth has disappeared. They may take your time. They may delay your dreams. They may even change the direction of your life. But they don't get to decide how your story ends. That part will always belong to you. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the moment that changed everything? Was it when Megan overheard the conversation, when the scholarship committee uncovered the records, or when she finally realized the truth had never stopped existing? Share your opinion in the comments. I read as many as I can, and I'd love to know what you would have done in her position. If you enjoy stories where patience, perseverance, and the truth ultimately prevail, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember, lies can survive for years, but they rarely survive forever.